Hey guys, today we begin with one of those wonderfully odd corners of history that nobody really talked about in school. Mostly because your teachers didn't want to explain it. So, tuck yourself in and let's drift back to the Middle Ages. Now, when we imagine medieval politics, we usually picture kings in heavy crowns, queens in elaborate dresses, and knights who never bathed. What we don't imagine, though maybe we should, are prostitutes quietly weaving themselves into the political machinery of Europe. Yes, the so-called oldest profession wasn't just operating in the shadows of taverns. It was, in its own way, part of diplomacy, espionage, and the general messiness of running a kingdom. Let's set the stage. Medieval courts were basically high-drama soap operas. You had insecure monarchs, rival nobles, scheming bishops, and a whole cast of people who thought poisoning was a perfectly reasonable way to solve an argument. And into this came the women's society labeled as fallen, though they were often much sharper than the men who dismissed them. Courtesans, mistresses, camp followers, whatever name you like, were often the secret carriers of information, influence, and occasionally royal heirs. Because yes, that happened more than once. Take, for instance, the royal courts of France in the 14th century. Kings and princes often surrounded themselves with a mix of advisors, flatterers, and women who were technically not supposed to be there, but definitely were. A mistress could sometimes whisper more into a king's ear than his entire council of ministers combined. And unlike the ministers, she didn't have to bore him with tax policy first. The pillow, in other words, was sometimes a better political stage than the throne room. Now, I should note, prostitution wasn't always hidden. In fact, medieval cities like Paris, London, and Florence often had official brothels, sometimes even regulated by the church. That's right. Priests and bishops would rather supervise the sin than try to eliminate it. It was seen as a kind of pressure valve for society, an awkward but necessary evil. And of course, wherever there was money, politics followed. Brothels became places where alliances were whispered, secrets exchanged, and reputations quietly destroyed. Think of them as the medieval equivalent of smoky backroom deals, only with more velvet curtains. One of the best examples comes from the Avignon papacy in the 14th century. Yes, the popes who lived in Avignon, not Rome, because apparently nothing says Holy Father like setting up shop in southern France. These popes were surrounded by courtiers, and many of those courtiers were surrounded by mistresses. Rumors swirled that information was traded through these women just as effectively as through official messengers. If you wanted to influence a cardinal, you didn't always bribe him with gold. Sometimes you offered him companionship, or better yet, the ear of the woman who already had his attention. And let's not forget soldiers. Medieval armies were famously followed by camp women. Some wives, some traders, and many prostitutes. These women weren't just there for company. They were informants. A sharp prostitute could gather gossip from drunk nights faster than a modern spy could hack your emails. And in an age when letters took weeks to arrive, a whispered rumor in the right ear could shape an entire battle strategy. Let's float over now to England, where kings were particularly bad at keeping their love lives private. Edward III, for instance, was rumored to keep not just mistresses but entire entourages of women at court. His officials might argue endlessly about the war with France, but if his mistress gave him a frown over breakfast, suddenly alliances shifted. It wasn't official policy, but it was politics all the same. So, while medieval chronicles like to write about knights jousting and kings negotiating treaties, a lot of the real influence came through quieter, more intimate channels. The irony, of course, is that the very women's society labeled as sinful or dangerous were often the ones steering conversations that reshaped kingdoms. So, let's slide a little deeper into this web of royal affection and quiet influence. We'll start with a classic. Royal mistresses who basically became unofficial members of government. One of the most famous examples in late medieval France was Agnes Sorel. She wasn't just a mistress of King Charles VII. She was the mistress, almost in an official capacity. Historians like to say she was the first recognized, official royal mistress. Imagine putting that on your medieval resume. Charles adored her so much that he showered her with titles, jewels, and even political access. She could recommend appointments, sway decisions, and tilt royal favor toward whoever managed to stay on her good side. Ministers who spent years perfecting their political strategy often found themselves outmaneuvered by a woman who simply had breakfast with the king. And here's the irony. Agnes was admired for her beauty but also criticized for being too influential. Chroniclers muttered about her as if she were the downfall of France. Which is funny, because Charles himself was famously indecisive and half the time didn't want to leave his bed. Honestly, without Agnes prodding him, he might have stayed under the covers while Burgundy ate up his kingdom. So yes, the mistress was accused of corrupting the king, but she was also one of the few people actually motivating him to rule. Across the channel in England, the same pattern played out in slightly more scandalous tones. Kings and nobles weren't discreet, and everyone knew who was slipping in and out of bedchambers. John of Gaunt, one of the most powerful men of 14th century England, had a long-term mistress named Catherine Swynford. Their relationship scandalized polite society, but here's the twist. After years of whispers and illegitimate children, he actually married her. Their descendants, the Beauforts, ended up shaping the entire Tudor dynasty. In other words, a so-called fallen woman was literally grandmother to kings. Not bad for someone the chroniclers liked to dismiss as improper. But it wasn't always about love stories. Sometimes it was raw politics. Prostitutes and mistresses were incredibly useful as spies. Picture this. You're a nobleman at a feast, you've had too much wine, and you're trying to impress the woman at your side. Maybe you drop a careless detail about troop movements, or maybe you complain about your lord. She smiles politely, nods, and remembers everything. The next morning, that same information is quietly sold or whispered to someone far more powerful. And because men tended to underestimate these women, they rarely saw the trap. Even the church wasn't immune. In some Italian city-states, bishops and cardinals kept their own mistresses, despite the obvious rules against it. These women became little nodes of influence, passing messages, securing favors, or simply making sure their lovers didn't oppose the wrong faction. Again, not exactly the saintly picture painted in sermons. But that's medieval politics for you, always a bit more human and a bit more messy than the official chronicles suggest. And of course, the hypocrisy was staggering. Men in power would condemn prostitution in public, then sneak through the back doors of brothels in private. It was almost a ritual. Medieval rulers had a knack for writing laws they had no intention of following themselves. And the women who navigated that double standard learned quickly. Morality was flexible, but information was priceless. Let's float now toward the Renaissance, where the role of courtesans became even more glamorous and even more political. In cities like Venice and Florence, elite courtesans weren't just tolerated. They were celebrated. They read poetry, discussed philosophy, and occasionally persuaded ambassadors. In some cases, their salons had more lively debate than the official councils. So, as we drift into the Renaissance, the whole game of politics and intimacy takes on an even shinier veneer. Medieval mistresses might have been whispered about in back corridors, but Renaissance courtesans often stepped boldly into the limelight. They were educated, witty, fashionable, basically influencers before Instagram existed. Take Venice, for example. The city had its famous courtigini oneste, honest courtesans. The term is hilarious because honesty was not their main trade, but it meant they weren't just common prostitutes. They were refined, cultured companions. These women could play the lute, recite Petrarchan poetry, and casually drop references to Plato over dinner. Imagine a Senate meeting full of stiff old men in robes. Then imagine them sneaking off later to discuss politics with someone who also happened to be their lover, their entertainer, and sometimes their financial advisor. One standout figure was Veronica Franco, a Venetian courtesan in the 16th century. She wasn't just beautiful, she was a published poet. She mingled with diplomats, artists, and nobles, and she was sharp enough to hold her own in debates that most men assumed she had no business in. Her writing survives, which means we get rare glimpses of her voice, and her words make it clear. She knew exactly how much power she held, and exactly how foolish men could be when they thought they were the clever ones. Now, Florence had its share too. The Medici family, who basically ran the city like their personal investment portfolio, often found themselves entangled with women who were more than companions. Courtesans around the Medici court carried rumors, brokered introductions, and made sure certain secrets reached exactly the right ears. It wasn't official politics, but it was politics all the same, softer, quieter, and wrapped in silk. Of course, not everyone was thrilled about this arrangement. Moralists ranted about the corruption of society. Preachers declared that the city would burn in hellfire, and pamphlets denounced the wickedness of courtesans. But behind closed doors, many of those same critics were visiting the very women they condemned. Hypocrisy remained the lifeblood of politics, as constant as the ringing of church bells. And here's the gentle irony. In a world where women were usually locked out of public office, courtesans carved a strange backdoor into political influence. They weren't given power, so they created their own. And while men mocked them, they kept coming back, because sometimes a courtesan understood strategy better than the generals. Or, at the very least, she knew how to stroke an ego until it agreed to do what she wanted. By the late Renaissance, the idea of the courtesan had become so well established that ambassadors sometimes wrote about them in reports. Imagine being a diplomat trying to describe trade negotiations, but also noting which noble was spending too much time with which courtesan. Because everyone knew. Influence didn't just flow in council chambers. It flowed in bedrooms, salons, and candlelit dinners where the wine never stopped. So, as the Renaissance glowed with art and architecture, another quiet network of influence kept humming in the background. Not painted in frescoes, not carved into marble, but whispered in soft voices that still managed to shake politics. So far we've floated through the softer side of this world. Women who influenced kings and poets, nudging politics from behind silk curtains. But of course, the higher you climbed in this game, the steeper the fall if things went wrong. And in the medieval and Renaissance world, they almost always did. Take Agnes Sorel again, the French royal mistress we met earlier. She rose high, adored by Charles VII, showered with jewels. But whispers started. Courtiers grumbled about her corrupting the king, and her early death at just 28 fueled even darker rumors. Some said she was poisoned. Others insisted her beauty itself was a kind of curse on the monarchy. In reality, she probably died of mercury poisoning, but not from a plot, just from the delightful medieval practice of using mercury in medicine. Yes, because apparently the best cure for illness was poison. Very on brand for the 15th century. England had its share of tragic endings too. Catherine Swynford, the mistress-turned-wife of John of Gaunt, did survive the scandal and eventually got her noble title. But many others weren't so lucky. Mistresses were often blamed when politics soured, as if the downfall of a dynasty could be pinned on one woman's smile. Convenient, of course, for kings who didn't want to take responsibility. Even in Venice, that playground of courtesans, Veronica Franco, our brilliant poet, faced the darker side of fame. She was accused of witchcraft during one of Venice's many paranoid purges. Because when men feared women who were clever and influential, the easiest solution was to accuse them of magic. She narrowly survived, but the trial left her reputation damaged. By the end of her life, she was broke and largely forgotten, which is depressing, but also very Renaissance. One moment you're dining with ambassadors, the next you're being called a witch by your neighbors. And sometimes the downfall wasn't about politics at all. It was just jealousy. A mistress might anger a queen or another rival at court, and suddenly she found herself exiled, stripped of wealth or worse. Queens tolerated a lot, but not always gracefully. Isabella of France, for example, was famously vengeful toward her husband Edward II's favorites, though in his case, those favorites were men. But the lesson applied broadly. If someone else was getting the attention, the royal spouse could be a dangerous enemy. It's worth pausing here to notice the double standard. Kings could keep mistresses by the dozen, and it was framed as manly vigor. But if a woman gained too much influence through that same role, she was slandered, vilified, or conveniently erased from the record. History was written by the men who had once whispered in her ear, and those pens weren't very forgiving. And yet, despite all the risks, women kept playing the game. Why? Because the alternative was often worse. For many, it was the only path to wealth, security, or a kind of agency in a world that denied them almost everything else. And some really did wield their influence like seasoned diplomats. They knew that gossip could be currency, that affection could be power, and that survival depended on balancing the two. So, as kingdoms rose and fell, as dynasties fought and crumbled, the quiet role of prostitutes and courtesans remained steady, invisible in chronicles, but deeply present in reality. They were blamed when things went wrong, ignored when things went right, and yet, without them, the history of medieval politics would look very different. So, as we drift toward the end of the story, let's zoom out a little. Across centuries of medieval and Renaissance Europe, the same quiet pattern repeats. Kings, princes, nobles, bishops, all the men who supposedly ran the world, were often guided, distracted, or cleverly managed by women who weren't even allowed a seat at the table. On parchment and in chronicles, the names of these women barely appear. They were simply labeled as mistresses, or dismissed as scandal. But if you look closely, you can see their fingerprints everywhere. Dynasties like the Tudors only existed because a long-term mistress became a legitimate wife. Wars were delayed or accelerated because a king was in a good, or bad, mood after a night in the company of someone he wasn't supposed to be with. Alliances were shaped not just in council halls, but in candlelit rooms where secrets spilled as easily as the wine. And yes, the hypocrisy hung thick in the air. Men in power condemned immorality in sermons, sponsored laws against brothels, and scolded society for its sins. Then, on the very same night, they slipped through the doors of those brothels, or entertained a mistress in the royal apartments. Everyone knew, but everyone also pretended not to know, which is really the most medieval thing of all. If there's a soft, almost amusing irony here, it's this. While official politics excluded women almost entirely, unofficial politics often depended on them. Courtesans, prostitutes, mistresses, whatever word you choose, occupied a space both despised and essential. They weren't celebrated in monuments, but they quietly shaped the decisions of men who were. And when you think about it, that's a kind of power. Fragile, risky, sometimes tragic, but still power. They couldn't wear crowns, but sometimes they tilted the crown on someone else's head. They couldn't lead armies, but they might know which direction those armies were marching before anyone else. And while the chroniclers wrote about kings and queens, the shadows in between the lines tell another story. So, as you settle deeper into your pillow, remember that history isn't just about battles, treaties, and coronations. It's also about whispered words in the dark, the quiet influence of overlooked figures, and the strange ways power sneaks through the cracks of official structures. Prostitutes in medieval politics didn't sit on thrones, but they were very much in the room where it happened. And that's where we'll leave it tonight. A gentle reminder that history, like life, is never as tidy as the textbooks suggest. Sometimes the biggest ripples come from the places no one wanted to admit existed. So don't forget to subscribe my channel and like this video.